evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's debate. My name is Helen Manning-Bennett and I'm the chairman, and Charlotte Sellers is timekeeper. The adjudicator is Ms Sonia Lowen. The topic of this debate is that Turnbull should stay in Parliament until the next election. The affirmative team seated to my right is from Adelaide High School. The negative team seated to my left is St Peter's Girls. The speaking time for this debate is 6 minutes. A single warning bell will sound at 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will sound at speaking time. A continuous bell may be rung 30 seconds after the speaking time, in which case the speaker must sit down immediately. Please ensure that your mobile phones and other electronic devices are switched off. Good? Yep. Okay, so I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Axel Hoffman.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that Malcolm Turnbull should stay in Parliament until the next election. As this topic no longer applies in the current tense, we suggest that changes to Malcolm Turnbull should have stayed in Parliament until the next election. We define Malcolm Turnbull as the most recent ex-Prime Minister of Australia. We define Parliament as the Parliament of Australia, the legislative branch of the Government of Australia, should as ought to, or to be obliged to, and election as the organised voting of representatives for the Parliament of Australia. And of course, as the affirmative team, we believe that Turnbull should have stayed in government until the next election. Today, I'll be talking to you about how Turnbull's job as an elected member is to represent his constituents for a full term, and how without Turnbull, the Liberal Party becomes dangerously conservative. And thirdly, how making changes in the government is not instantaneous, and Turnbull should have had time for his proposals and ideas to see the light. Our second speaker, Jagreet Malhi, will point out some flaws in the opposition's arguments, as well as talk to you about how the public opinion in the matter could jeopardise the government as a whole, and how Turnbull was a good and prominent figure in the government. Our third and final speaker, Mitchell Miller, will rebut and sum our team case. Now I'm going to discuss my 3 points with you. My first point is that Turnbull's job as an elected member is to represent his constituents for a full term. Turnbull's leave has let down his constituents by breaking the unspoken commitment that an elected member should represent for a full term, regardless of the disagreements within the party itself. In addition to this, Turnbull's electorate, the division of Wentworth, is now without a member representing them in Parliament until the next by-election. This is a large disadvantage to the Parliament as a whole, and with less of a selection of members to create accurate and well-rounded changes. In addition to this, without Turnbull, the Liberal Party no longer holds a majority in Parliament, as they used to have 1 over half of the representatives on their side, but are now stuck with only half, meaning they must rely on the independents and smaller parties to support their ideas. This alone could be detrimental to the government, causing political unrest and the general population to doubt politicians' reliability. This is one of the many reasons we, the affirmative team, believe that Turnbull should have stayed in government until the next election. My second point is how now, without Turnbull and the Liberal Party, the coalition is now dangerously conservative and right-winged. Malcolm Turnbull kept the balance within the Liberal Party with his progressive ideologies, but now that he has left, the Conservatives have almost full control over the Liberal Party. The danger of this is due to many of the Conservatives being climate change skeptics, such as Scott Morrison and John Howard, and as such want Australia to withdraw from the Paris Agreement and deny change into more eco-friendly energy sources such as solar and wind. According to the Australian Academy of Science, burning fossil fuels such as coal created an increase in the atmospheric carbon dioxide from 280 parts per million before 1800 to near 400 parts per million in 2013. With the Liberal Party overwhelmingly denying climate change, this could have a detrimental impact on the future of Australia as well as the environment as a whole. Due to this and many other reasons, we, the affirmative team, believe that Malcolm Turnbull should have undeniably stayed in Parliament until the next election. My third and final point is how making changes in the government takes time, and what Turnbull has proposed or completed requires time to see the light. As stated in my second point, Turnbull's progressive and successful ideas have been cut off thanks to the Conservatives. As Turnbull has not only been removed from the position of Prime Minister, he has also left Parliament as a whole. It has not only denied him the opportunity to progress Australia, it will create a negative impact due to Scott Morrison and the Conservatives, possibly even reversing the progression made against climate change. If Turnbull was to stay in government, or even better, the Liberal Party, his changes may not be neglected or outright annihilated in the future. As I elaborated on earlier, this could have a horrendous impact on climate change. Turnbull was one of the few within the Liberal Party that agreed with climate change. And with him gone, Australia is at risk of leaving the Paris Agreement, which may jeopardise future international relations, which will be elaborated on by our second speaker. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, we, the affirmative team, are utterly sure that Malcolm Turnbull should have stayed in Parliament until the next election.
I call upon the first negative speaker, Matilda Braithwaite.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate is that Turnbull should have stayed in Parliament until the next election. We agree with the definition given by the affirmative team. However, we as the negative team believe this statement is false. Today, as first speaker, I will be discussing the lack of support Turnbull has from his party and country, therefore making it extremely hard to pass decisions through Parliament when there is a lack of continuity. In addition, I will talk about how Turnbull could not live up to his initial claims and promises, therefore showing he does not have Australia's best interests in perspective when in Parliament. Our second speaker will speak about the scenario that would be if Turnbull remains in Parliament and how us Australians will not see any change. Moreover, the sole reason he was replaced was to appoint someone who would bring about change, allowing us to move forward as a country. Our third speaker will then rebut and sum up our team case. However, before I begin my debate, I would like to point out some flaws in the opposition's argument. The first affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that Turnbull had progressive and useful ideas. This is in fact wrong because Turnbull has been in Parliament for 3 years and has not made any progress that the electors saw as beneficial in solving Australia's main problems, as I will later elaborate on in my speech. On to my first point, that Turnbull should not have stayed in Parliament until the next election, as he would not have the backing or support of his party or country. If Turnbull were to stay in Parliament, there would be no continuity in the Liberal Party due to the fact Turnbull was voted out. This is because there were disagreements as he was seen as an overall weakness to the party. As a whole, Parliament did not wish to have him as Prime Minister any longer, so if he had stayed appointed, there would have been upsets and disputes in the party. After the initial Liberal spill and leadership challenge, Senator Cormann stated that Turnbull no longer had the support of majority of the members in the Liberal room. A petition was formed against Turnbull, and the Senator and Cabinet Ministers held a press conference to publicly reveal they no longer supported Mr Turnbull as Liberal leader. With a lack of support from his own party, it would have been extremely difficult to come to terms on decisions that run through Parliament. In his most recent press conference, even Turnbull himself admitted that his party wanted to bring down the Liberals in order to get rid of him. As you can see, the entire reason a dispute in Parliament started in the first place was because Turnbull's support from his party was diminishing. Moreover, Turnbull would not have support from the general Australian population. A report in The Guardian showed a survey that spans over the past 3 years Turnbull has been in Parliament. It shows an overall decrease in national approval of his work. An average of 43% of Australia's population disapprove, while only 39% approve, showing there is a considerable 10.4 million Australians who don't back Turnbull. This proves that Turnbull should not have stayed in Parliament until the next election, because he has little, if any, support from both his country and his party. If people don't want him there, then he shouldn't stay. This leads me to my second point, that Turnbull should not have stayed in Parliament until the next election because he didn't fulfil his promises which got him elected in the first place, and therefore doesn't have Australia's best interests at heart. It was defined by Elizabeth Truss, MP and Treasurer of South West Norfolk, that a Member of Parliament is to scrutinise legislation, attend debates, and generally protest, advocate and promote the interests of their constituency at a national level. Turnbull does not fulfil this role and should therefore not remain as a Member of Parliament. Moreover, he was labelled by the Sunday Morning Herald as the weakest and most indecisive Prime Minister since Billy Mahon. In case you are unfamiliar with him, he is thought to be the weakest Prime Minister in Australian history who achieved close to nothing, along with being despised by most of his colleagues, according to a report by the ABC. Now, if Turnbull is being compared to him, that must be a sign that Turnbull should not stay in Parliament, as he simply does not have the country's best interests as his priority. His plan for jobs and growth that this country so needed underwhelmed the electors by a long shot and has put Australia behind the times in growth, jobs, consumer and investor confidence. Turnbull has never shown any sign of being imbued with a coherent strategy for jobs, growth or emerging issues of house affordability. These issues that Turnbull continuously failed to solve, or at least assist in, are some of the most prevalent in Australian society. The Business Insider leaked that job prospects in Australia are slowing and considerably lower than other comparable countries, and homelessness, due to a factor such as expensive housing, have made no considerable progress in the past few years. Turnbull should not have stayed in Parliament until the next election because he did not actively address Australia's most prominent issues, so it was best to replace him with someone more suited to the role as quickly as possible. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, Turnbull should most definitely not have stayed in Parliament until the next election because he lacks support and does not have Australia's best interests in mind. Turnbull has proven to be an overly underwhelming Prime Minister and Member of Parliament, failing to address Australia's needs and losing support of the majority of the country. Thank you.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Jean-Luc Murray.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for today's debate is that Turnbull should stay in Parliament until the next election. As a member of the affirmative team, I believe the statement is true. We believe that Malcolm Turnbull should have remained in Parliament until his term was completed, a point our first speaker touched on. Now, before I present my arguments, I'd first like to point out some flaws in the opposition's arguments. The first speaker has tried to tell you that Turnbull quickly lost the support of his party due to his decisions or lack thereof of his decisions. Turnbull tried to keep the party from becoming overly conservative, which, while possibly not in line with the entire party, which while possibly not in line with the entire party, was overall better for the advancement of Australia, in the long term, that is. This was because he had seen what damage Tony Abbott had caused by being too conservative and too right-wing. And yes, he did lose the support of his party because of this, but we are not discussing how he was voted out, rather why, and why he should have stayed, based on his attitude and what he brought to the Liberal Party. Because of this, we are presenting you with a multitude of reasons why Turnbull was the right man for the job, and directed Australia in the direction it needed to go. Our first speaker discussed that Turnbull should have been given the chance to represent his party until the official end of his term, which would mean that many of his propositions would see action. His second point was that the absence of Malcolm Turnbull from the government and the position of Prime Minister would mean that the already strained Liberal Party would lean towards the more conservative side. His third point was that Turnbull should have been given more time for his policies to come into effect. Now I'll continue on to my first point. There have been a total of 6 prime ministerial seat changes in the last 8 years, from the 2-time seat keeper Kevin Rudd to the most recent being, of course, the newly elected Scott Morrison. The rapidity at which prime ministerial positions are getting replaced is on the rise, since after the last federal election, Australia has seen 3 new prime ministers. Let that sink in. 3 prime ministers since 2015. This is a key and shocking reminder of the gradually decreasing stability of our government, as compared to previous years, where prime ministers were able to serve out their terms fully, even, quote, dining in together and discussing plans for the future, end quote, stated Rodney Tiffin, Professor of Government in the University of Sydney, when describing opposition leaders Mick O'Halloran and Thomas Playford in 1950. This lack of consistent leadership also creates public distrust when regarding the government, as shown by a public poll conducted by the Australian Broadcasting Company, which showed that over 75% of participants were fed up with the state of the government, demanding that the Prime Minister be decided in the next federal election, instead of behind closed doors. Furthermore, a multitude of international deals and diplomacy could be put at risk due to the ever-shifting landscape of prime ministership. Diplomatic relations with the Chinese government, in one case, were under strain from the changing foreign policies left behind by the Labour government, which Malcolm Turnbull was working adamantly to preserve. This effort was seeing gradual improvement, but as Turnbull's position has been replaced, these deals could be put in jeopardy due to Morrison's ideals. Morrison, identifying with the more conservative wing, in an official statement when he was Minister for Home Affairs, announced that the Chinese telecom firm Huawei would be barred from Australia's 5G network, among other things. Considering Huawei is now the world's 2nd largest smartphone manufacturer in the world, after Samsung, this would not only detriment Australia's economy, but deteriorate Australia's global relations with China. Because of the government destabilisation, Australian national and international relations would face dire consequences, which is why Turnbull should remain in Parliament, to keep that order. My second point is that Turnbull, as a political leader, has proven to be adept in his method of political management and has overseen various achievements during his time as Prime Minister, which heavily outweigh those when the party was under Tony Abbott's direction. With the chief economist of the Australian Institute of Company of Directors, Stephen Walter, agreeing that Turnbull was much better than Abbott in terms of company well-being. According to the official Liberal Party site, the Turnbull government saw the Australian employment crisis being corrected with the employment of over 400,000 new employments, the most number of jobs in a calendar year ever recorded in Australian history, same-sex marriage being legalised, and better repeal of Labor's carbon and mining taxes, in direct opposition to the negative side that said he had not done anything, which is quite false. According to a NAB survey on business conditions and confidence, Turnbull's government had restored and surpassed the business confidence deficit that the Rudd-Gillard government had created, displaying the effort put in by Turnbull to better this country. By having Turnbull remain in Parliament until the next election, we could see his influence greatly affect future decisions for the betterment of Australia, as Morrison's conservative ideals parallel those of Tony Abbott. Ladies and gentlemen, as the affirmative side we believe that Turnbull remaining in Parliament until the next election is better for not only the government, but for the nation as a whole. Thank you.
I call upon the second negative speaker, Adelaide.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate is that Turnbull should stay in Parliament until the next election, and we, the negative team, believe that this statement is false. Before I begin my debate, I would like to point out some flaws in the opposition's argument. The first speaker stated that Turnbull has the responsibility to represent Liberal for a full term. While this may be correct, he also has the responsibility to fulfil his promises that he made, as our first speaker has already discussed. Also, an Australian Prime Minister hasn't served a full term since John Howard in 2009. The second negative speaker has tried to tell you that while Turnbull disputes within his own party, his ideas were forward-thinking and for the best of the country. May we ask how, seeing as Turnbull's forward-thinking decisions have in fact put Australia behind the times in job prospects and backtracked into homelessness rates? Our first speaker has already stated that Malcolm Turnbull doesn't have the backing from his party or from Australia, as he doesn't live up to his claims and doesn't have Australia's best interests at heart. Today I will be discussing how we change Prime Ministers to see change in Australia, and that there are still important issues which haven't been improved. To listen in on any halfway serious discussion of politics these days is to eavesdrop on a cacophony of dissatisfaction. Issues come and go, but the underlying unease remains no matter how much we vent or how many logical arguments we make about a given issue. This is unsatisfactory, as Turnbull spent too much time worrying about the day-to-day issues rather than addressing our underlying drivers of the problems. There are a number of these drivers, but there are particular ones that need our attention if we are ever to move out of the rut we are in. All three are intimately connected, the three main drivers being the party system, the voting system, and the media. Firstly, the party system. Political scientist Peter Mayer said it best in his book, Ruling the Void, the Hollowing of Western Democracy. The age of party democracy has passed. Although the parties themselves remain, they have become so disconnected from the wider society and pursue the form of competition that is so lacking in meaning that they no longer seem capable of sustaining democracy in its present form. This is why survey after survey shows that people are not just alienated from parties, but from democracy itself. Once the parties connected us to our sovereignty, now they trade it away to corporations and transnational organisations like the World Bank. In doing so, they compromise their very reason for existing. Economic management is no longer aligned with the will of the people, but with demands of global capitals. Services from health to education to unemployment benefits are reduced in order to fund tax cuts for the wealthy. The inherent lack of political authority that arises from this all manifests from the Liberal side. In endless leadership changes as they look for a messiah rather than tackle structural reform. On the coalition side, it increasingly means the obsession with discipline and punishment as they seek relevance in those areas where they still have some traction, such as border control, surveillance, and terrorism. We, the people, don't so much disengage as despair. The voting system in the lower house, the place where government is formed, is specifically designed to channel votes via the preference system to the two major parties. In other words, the method we use for choosing our elected representatives as its primary feature, a mechanism that gives our votes up to two of the weakest links in the democratic system. Once you could argue preferential voting provided stability, now it reinforces mediocrity and rewards motionlessness. What about the Senate? The point about the Senate is that it throws up fringe players, as elite non-stops argue. But that shows that given the choice, people almost never choose to give the two major parties outright control. This is not anti-politics, it is an indication that people want alternatives. Finally, the media. In his book Slideshow, Lindsay Tanner argued that politicians trivialise issues because it's the only way that the media will pay any attention. The media argued back, saying that they are simply reporting what politicians are doing. It's the chicken and egg argument, and from a citizen's point of view, it doesn't matter which came first, we all suffer. To quote Anthony Painter from the British think tank Policy Network, the modern state is designed around competing elites who are insiders in the system. The electoral system maintains this duopoly around this elite contest. A media is constructed and organised. Party organisations exist to manufacture majorities to serve it. This system is replicated over time. The state, the party system and the media all tied together in enduring status quo. Although Turnbull addresses many issues in his time as Prime Minister, but failed to tackle the major issues in Parliament that are preventing politicians from many successful and beneficial changes. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, we, the Negative team, strongly believe that Malcolm Turnbull should not stay in Parliament until the next election because of these reasons explained by the Negative team today.
I call upon the third affirmative speaker, Mitchell Miller.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's debate. The topic of this debate is that Malcolm Turnbull should stay in Parliament until the next election. As a decision has already been made on the topic, we are taking liberties with the tenets of the topic. We, as the affirmative team, believe this statement to be undoubtedly correct. I will begin my argument by pointing out some flaws in the negative speakers so far. I will then continue by recapping what my team speakers have argued so far. The first affirmative speaker has quoted someone saying that Malcolm Turnbull is the weakest, most indecisive Prime Minister thus far. This is widely false, as Malcolm Turnbull has achieved a lot, as our second speaker, Jagreet, elaborated on. He has created over 400,000 employments and got across same-sex marriage. The main reason for Mr. Turnbull's difficulty in making a lot of policies come to fruition is that the Liberal Party has only one more than the majority. Therefore, if only a few members of the Liberal Party cross the floor, which means them to vote against the Liberal Party's movement, the movement will not go through at all. Even with this happening, Malcolm Turnbull still pushed incredibly hardly for the National Energy Guarantee to go through, which would introduce further regulations for energy distribution companies. The first affirmative speaker has also told you that Malcolm Turnbull does not have the best interests of Australia at heart. While we think about this, does Scott Morrison have these interests at heart either? As our first speaker said, he does not want to make moves on climate change, as he and most of the rest of the Liberal Party are highly conservative, thus risking jeopardisation of international relations. It might be worse to have Scott Morrison in Parliament rather than Malcolm Turnbull, and as such, we believe that Malcolm Turnbull should stay in Parliament till the next election, such that the public can decide. The first speaker has also told you that Malcolm Turnbull only has 3 years of experience. While he may only have 3 years of experience while he may only have very little experience as Prime Minister, he has much more as a representative in Parliament, as he's been a representative of Wentworth since 2004. He has seen many governments go through and knows what works. and has been working hard to put these ideas into action. The opposition has tried to convince you that Turnbull did not represent the people as he was not initially voted in through traditional elections. While Malcolm Turnbull may have initially been sworn in by an in-house vote, he then went on to lead the Liberal National Party through another election in 2016, which he won. Therefore, even though the people may not have voted him in to begin with, he was able to prove his capability and won the vote majority. The second affirmative speaker discussed in her points that there was a problem with the wider government. And now, in this debate, we're only talking about Malcolm Turnbull, and as such, this argument is not extremely relevant. Now I will revisit my team's arguments. Our first speaker, Axel, talked to you about how it is Mr. Turnbull's job and obligation to represent his electorate for a full term, and that he should be given the full opportunity and time to fulfil the promises he made to his electorate. Other politicians that are widely regarded as great have only been so due to them having enough time and a majority greater than one to allow them to come true on their policies. His second point was that without Turnbull in Parliament, the Liberal Party is dangerously close to swinging to the right wing and becoming overly conservative. By keeping the government away from this, Turnbull has been able to keep Australia moving forward. His final point was that making changes in Parliament takes time. Turnbull should therefore be given the full term he had been told he would have to fulfil the promises he made. This rings especially true for the current government, as most of Malcolm's possible successors will either change policies as most of Malcolm's possible successors will either change his policies past his original intentions or stop the development of these policies overall. Our second speaker discussed two further points. His first, the public and international backlash of opinion could and would likely jeopardise the Liberal Party. By having this happen, international affairs would suffer as Australia could be seen as having an unstable government. His second was about how much better Malcolm Turnbull was in what he did and his policies than Tony Abbott, for example, whom he was voted by Parliament to replace. One of the examples Jagri gave was his work on reducing unemployment. He made a much greater effort than Abbott and most other recent Prime Ministers, and any shortcoming was due to his small majority of seats. So, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chairman, as the affirmative team, we believe and know that Malcolm Turnbull should have stayed in Parliament to continue his term, even if not under the Liberal Party, as is his responsibility. Finally, upon his dismissal, perhaps Malcolm Turnbull could have uttered the words of great bard Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, et tu, Brutus. Thank you.
Okay, I call upon the third negative speaker, Emily Downing.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, adjudicator, Madam Chairperson and timekeeper. By this stage, you will probably be very well informed of the topic for tonight's debate. But for those of you who don't, I will remind you again that we, the negative team, disagree with the fact that Malcolm Turnbull should have ended his time in Parliament. My job for tonight is to summarise my team's case, but not before I rebut the opposing team's argument. The first speaker claims that the Liberal Party will no longer have the majority after losing Turnbull in the Wentworth seat. We disagree, as Liberal has held this seat since 1944, and it is very likely that another Liberal member will be re-elected into this seat, pushing the Liberal Party into the majority again. The affirmative team have also argued that Turnbull had progressive ideas in terms of energy usage and becoming a more sustainable country. We disagree due to the fact that Turnbull was forced to reconsider these ideas and make them less progressive in order for the coalition to agree and support his initiatives. So even if Turnbull did stay in Parliament, his lack of support meant his progressive ideas are unlikely to be put into action, and they are in fact one of the reasons the Lib spill actually occurred. and because of this, Malcolm's progressive attitude will have little impact, and therefore it is not a good reason to keep him in Parliament. The second speaker has argued that Turnbull must serve his full term as Australia has a history of an unstable government due to the fact that we have gone through 3 Prime Ministers in 1 year. But we believe that Australia's tradition of quickly going through Prime Ministers has other advantages. For example, entertainment. Within one night after the lib spill, popular online newspaper Mamma Mia had already posted an article featuring 11 political memes, and hashtag libspill was trending on Twitter. Additionally, by the next day, a post on You Know You're Australian When, an iconic Australian Instagram with 40,000 followers, already had 20,000 likes on their post featuring a man changing a fire alarm and captioned, "Remember Australia, a change in Prime Ministers means you change your fire alarm." This continued replacement of Prime Ministers is not a hindrance, but instead provides entertainment for the increasing number of Australians that are actually not interested in politics. Also, if you looked at this argument through a political perspective, we, the negative team, cannot stress enough that it is not actually the ever-changing Prime Ministers who put citizens on our knees, but the fact that the Prime Ministers themselves are the one causing the issues and wanting to be voted out. The third speaker has said that we argued that Turnbull was not elected into Parliament the traditional way. We did not actually make that point, but it would have been a good one. Instead, we explained how surveys over 3 years showed Australia's growing disapproval with Malcolm Turnbull as our Prime Minister. And this kind of overrides the fact that they pointed out that Turnbull was voted in another way. The second affirmative speaker has also tried to tell you that another year in Parliament would allow Malcolm Turnbull to make more beneficial changes. We disagree again, because if he hasn't made any of the changes in 3 years, like our first and second speaker have said, then it is not likely he's going to make them all in 1 year. Now I would like to summarise my team's case. Our case began with our first speaker, who introduced the definition and then spoke about the lack of support Turnbull receives from both his country and his party, and how this decreases the quality of his work and his ability to make change. She also discusses how Turnbull does not have Australia's best interests at heart, and not only does he fail to fulfil the promises he made in his election campaign, but he has put Australia behind the times in terms of growth, jobs, consumer and investor confidence. The fact that Malcolm Turnbull has brought about no change is reinforced by our second speaker, Amelie, who explains Turnbull's inability to address the major issues the government is tackling on a daily basis. Ladies and gentlemen, Malcolm Turnbull left Parliament unchanged, with little support from both his country and party, and we, the negative team, believe it is a good reason that he left when he did. Thank you.